All right, guys, thank you for coming. So today, our goal is to really go over most parts of your practice test 1 test. So I'm not going to run a session mainly. It's going to be 10-10. So she's also a student, but she took 2030 with me back in the summer. She did very well. I think if you got any questions about how to perform well in the test, you can also feel free to ask her, right? So she's here really mainly to help you. So she's going to go from the beginning until the end. So I think since the session might be long, I understand you may have other schedule. So what I will do is I'll try to take maybe a break for every 30 to 40 minutes. So if you really have to leave, you can wait for the next break. But whenever you want to leave, also feel free. That's okay. So we'll decide whether we're going to release the recording. The recording for now just for TA training purpose. But just stay here and then ask questions whenever you need to. All right? Tintin, go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to the review session. I know it's a Friday afternoon. You guys probably have places to be. So thank you for coming. Hopefully, this session is going to be helpful for you guys. I'm just going to be going over the practice test 1 solutions and kind of giving you guys a sense of what to expect on the programming test. So let's just get started. You should have your project imported already. But yeah, if you don't know how to import it, it should be in the tutorial videos from Jackie. After you import the project, you just want to open up the starter tests. And in the starter test, you'll see a bunch of compilation errors. So here you have two options. First option is to get rid of all the compilation errors right away. This option is good because it ensures that your final solution doesn't have any compilation errors. Because if there is compilation errors, that will lead to a deduction. But this method, there's a bit of a con where you have to spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes at the very beginning just getting rid of the compilation errors. So you might not want to do that. The other option is to just get rid of the compilation errors as you go test case by test case. And that also has the benefit that you can clearly see what new things are being added and what you might want to implement for that specific test case. But I would suggest maybe try both methods if you have time and see which one you prefer doing. So let's just get started with the first test case. I'm going to do the method where we do test case by test case, just because it's a bit more clear about what we need to add. So let me comment out all of these first, and just leave the first one. Sorry, it's a little bit long. Yeah, so we'll comment these out. And start with the first test case. So we want to get rid of this compilation error first, right? We see that it's a variable type, which means that we need to create a new class. So I'm using the shortcut here. If you hover over it, you'll see that there's some quick fixes that Eclipse suggests. You can click Create Class, and then it'll automatically generate the class name and everything for you. Just make sure you choose the model package here. So switch to model package, and then click Finish, and that's going to create your class. The other way is to do it manually, which I'm pretty sure you guys already know how to do, so I'm going to skip over that. But yeah, once you have your class, I'm going to actually put it onto this side panel just so we can see what's going on. And yeah, so here, now we need to fix this compilation error, which is the constructor. So again, we can hover over it and do create constructor. And for me, I personally prefer doing the suggestions just because it's a little bit faster during the programming test. You don't have to type out everything yourself. But if you prefer to type it out, you can always do it that way as well. Okay, so with the suggestions, they're going to give you pretty generic parameter names, so you probably want to rename those. Now, if we look here at the comment, it says we need to create a constructor with the course name, the number of credits, and then the number of raw marks. So let's rename these parameters to course. And then this one will be credits. And then this one will be marks. Okay, and then in here, since we have these parameters, that means we probably have to initialize some attributes, right? So this implies that we'll have an attribute called course, and then an attribute called credits, and then also an attribute called marks. And we'll just initialize all of these in here. So you guys probably already know how to do constructors. So for the sake of time, I'm going to just copy and paste this in. And we're basically just initializing the attributes. Okay, and then the next compilation errors here are get course name, get number of credits, and get marks, which are all accessor methods. So you guys also probably are familiar with accessor methods. And so I'm just gonna, again, copy and paste this in just for the sake of time.
Yeah, don't panic if you cannot follow exactly the pace. I'm also going to make the solution code to you after the session, so you can also get access to it. So if you want to focus only on comprehending what Pantheon is trying to say, you can also do that. Okay.
Okay, so now the compilation errors are gone. We have the implementation done. This is just like the basic getters and the basic constructor. So now we can run the test case and should be able to pass it. Okay, I need to select specifically that test case, right-click, and then go to Run as JUnit test. It says there are errors. Okay, so the reason why this is happening is because we have some import statements up here. We haven't created the registrar class or the transcript class yet, so I'm gonna get rid of these for now. These will also be automatically added in whenever we create new classes, so you don't have to worry about that. If you want to get rid of those imports, it's fine. Okay, so now we can try running. Okay, and we passed the first test, so we can move on to the second one. Also, can you guys hear me okay? I feel like maybe yeah, it's good? Okay. Okay, so now we're moving on to the next constructor. So this is called an overloaded constructor, which just means that we're taking different arguments or a different number of arguments. So I'll do create constructor. And then here we need the course name and the number of credits, but no marks. Okay, so for this, we can do literally the exact same thing. I'm going to copy and paste, but we can just leave out marks. Now, you might be wondering, what should we set marks to if it's not appearing as a parameter here? You can check the other test cases to get an idea of what you need to do. So here at the very last assert equals, it's saying r2.getMarks should return a value of 0. And since we didn't set the marks anywhere, that means the default, we should just set this dot marks, if I can spell correctly, this dot marks equals 0. Okay. So now if we save this and run, it should be good. All right. So let's move on to the next one. So this one, we have a mutator method. So this is a setter. It's setting marks to a specific number. And again, you guys should be familiar with setters. So I'm going to copy and paste it. So I'll just put it over here. And we're just setting the marks attribute to the parameter that was inputted. Okay, so let's run that. Okay, we're good. Yeah, the red line was just there because I think it wasn't loading or updating, but yeah, we're good now. Okay, so now this is where the methods get a little bit more complicated. This one is get letter grade. So whenever you see a new method you need to implement, always try to read the comments. It'll generally tell you how to implement it. So here we need to return some string letter grade we return the string letter grade depending on what the raw marks are. So it says here if the marks are greater than or equal to 90, we get an A+. If it's between 80 and 90, we get an A, and so on. So in the case where we have a bunch of different cases to consider, we generally want to use an if-else-if structure. So let's make the method. Okay, and another note about auto-generating the methods is you want to always check the return type because it might not be accurate. So we see that we're supposed to be returning a string, right? So let's just change object here to the string. And then in here, as I said, we have different cases. So we'll do if and else if and so on. So I'm just going to do like the general structure here, and we'll fill in the blanks. So first, the first case we need to consider is if marks is greater than or equal to 90, right? So we're just going to check the condition that this dot marks is greater than or equal to 90. Okay, and in the case that this is greater than or equal to 90, we want to return a plus. So let's create a variable called LG for letter grade. Actually, you know what, I'm going to call it result. It doesn't matter what you name it, but yeah, we'll do the variable to return. And we can set it to null or an empty string. I'm just going to do null. And then in here, we'll set result equal to a plus. Okay, and then for the next case, we want to consider if the marks is between 80 and 90. For this, we only need to check if the marks is greater than or equal to 80, because we already checked if it's greater than or equal to 90 up here, right? So in the case that it isn't greater than or equal to 90, we'll automatically just go to this. So this dot marks greater than or equal to 80, and then we set result equal to A. Okay, so for the rest, this should be pretty similar. So I'm just going to grab the solution from here for the rest of the cases. So I'll just put it in here. Okay, and then for the else condition, it's basically if the mark is not greater than or equal to 50, then we go to the else condition and we set the result to F. So then we return result, and we should be good. Okay, so that's good. Let's move on to the next one. For this one, it's pretty similar to what we just did, but instead we're converting the letter grade to some grade point number. So we're going to use the same structure here, but instead of this dot marks, we're going to check the letter grade. So let me create the method, double check the return type. This should be an int value because we're checking some number here. And then in here, we need to check the letter grade. So let's make a variable to store the letter grade. So this dot get letter grade, or yeah, get letter grade. And we're just making use of the code we wrote before. Okay, so in this situation, you're using the same structure. So we'll do if letter grade. And in this case, letter grade is a string. So we want to use the equals method. So equals a plus. Then we want to return the number 9. So we would have another variable here called GP for grade point. You can set it to 0 initially, and then we'll set grade point to 9 over here. So again, this is the same structure as before. So I'm just going to grab the solutions again. And now we have our grade points. But you need to make sure you read all of the comments. It says here that the grade point is the number of credit, sorry, the grade point, the weighted grade point is the grade point times the number of credits. So we're going to take grade point, multiply it by the credits, and that's the value we return. Okay, so we run this, should be okay. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so for this test case, we need to create a new class because we see a new variable type over here. So let's make a new class. make sure it's in the model package. And I'm just going to stick it over here so it's a bit easier to see. And again, we need a constructor. You guys know how to make constructors, so I'm going to skip over that. Okay, I'm not going to skip over all of it actually. So for this part, we're just assigning the name to the name attribute. So the name that we input to the name attribute. But then over here, if you look at this line, we have get report, which returns all the stored registrations in the transcript. So we don't see any other clues about how to store registrations in here. So when that happens, what you can do is go up to the very top of the tests, and it usually will give you an overview of what attributes you need to add into your class. So here, if we look at the transcript, it says each transcript is characterized by a student's unique name and a list of up to 60 current registrations. So that means we need the attribute name, and we need an array. And how do we know it's an array? Because it says a list, right? And how do we know the type? It says registrations. So we want a registration array. And I'll name this registrations. And whenever we have a new array, we want to make sure always to add a counter variable to keep track of the number of elements that are stored in the array. So I'm going to do private int NOR to stand for number of registrations. And then, now that we have the attributes, we need to initialize them in the constructor. So this dot registrations, we're going to assign a new registration array. And what's the max capacity? Again, you're going to refer to the comments. It'll tell you up to 60 current registrations. So we're going to put the max capacity of 60. Okay, and then this dot NOR can be assigned 0, or you can leave it like you don't need to assign it, because it'll automatically assign it a default value of 0 anyways. Okay, so we have that. And now we can implement get report. So check the return type, make sure it's the correct one. And then for get report, it says we need to return all the stored registrations. But right now, if we look at the test case, it's just really expecting an array of length 0. So just to pass this test case, what we can do is just return a new registration array of length 0. Of course, this isn't the final implementation, but just to pass this test case for now, this is what I'm going to put. During the actual programming test, if you know what implementation you need to put, then just type it out directly. That'll save you some time, and you won't get confused later on. But yeah, for this review session, I'm just going to put this for now. So if we run this, should be good. Yep. And let's move on to the next one. Okay, so this is a new method we need to add, which is called add registration. And so this is just adding registration objects into our registrations array. And for this, I'm just going to rename the parameter really quickly to just R. Okay, so for this, you guys should have already seen this in your Lab 0 Part 2 tutorial video. So I'm not going to type it all out, but I will just quickly describe what this method is doing. So here, what it's doing is basically it's assigning the registration argument that you pass to this dot registrations array at the index of number of registrations. And then we're incrementing the number of registrations by 1. So that's all that method is doing. And now, let's try checking the test case. So you see, we actually have a failure. So when this happens, don't panic. What you want to do first is just double click on the test case that's failing, and it'll tell you what line it's failing at. So it's saying that it's failing at this line over here. And in order to get an idea of what's happening, you can go back to the JUnit and it'll tell you in the failure trace the specific issue that's occurring. So it says here there's an array index out of bounds exception, and it says there's an array index out of bounds exception at this line. So generally, if you can just quickly skim over your code and try to figure out what's going on, that will be the fastest way to find the problem, but a lot of the times you won't be able to find the problem just by looking at it. So what we can do is use the debug mode. So the debugger in Eclipse is a little bit confusing. Personally, I found it pretty confusing when I was first using it. But what I would recommend for you guys is to just go home and spend maybe 30 minutes exploring the debugger and getting familiar with it, because it's really helpful when you have bugs in your project during your programming test and you don't know what to do. So I'm going to show you a very quick demonstration of how to use the debugger. So the first thing that you want to do is add a breakpoint into your project. And to do that, you just double-click beside the line number that you want to stop at. And what the breakpoint does is it basically pauses the execution of your project right before this line is executed. So now if we click the bug icon up here, it'll pause.
2030.
Get
yourself comfortable.
Yeah, so it'll pause it right here, and before you're able to use the debugger, it'll ask you if you want to confirm the perspective switch. Just note that the debugger and the normal coding view is different, so you'll need to confirm the switch. Okay, so now we're switching into the debugger. So we're paused right before this line is executed. And there's two very useful tools for the debugger that I find. And one of them is step into up here, which basically allows you to go into a method and see what's happening inside of the method. And the other option is using variables and expressions. And those let you just see the value of variables in the current context. So for this line, there's no method calls, so I'm just going to use the variables and expressions. Okay, so if you recall, the issue we had was an array index out of bounds exception, which means that it's probably happening to this array right here. So let's look for this array variable inside of our variables tab here. So you see Allen registrations here. It's saying that it's an empty array, right? So with empty arrays, that means you can't really index into them. I have a very quick illustration. With normal arrays, you have slots you can index into, right? An empty array is literally a line or something. There's no spots that you can index into, so whatever index you put, it'll go out of bounds. So that means that that's where our issue is coming from. So let's look into this a bit further. Where are we getting Allen registrations from? So if we look at our code, up here, we see that we're assigning Allen registrations, the return value of Allen.getReport. So let's actually put another breakpoint over here and see what's going on this line. So in order to start at this breakpoint, you're going to need to terminate the debugger. So up here, there's a red button, you terminate. And then you can click the bug again, and it'll run the debug again. But this time, starting at this line here. So now, since we have a method call, we can use the step into option. So I'm going to click step into. And you see here, we go to the transcript class. And the reason why we're going into the transcript class is because getReport is being called on Allen, right? And Allen is an object of type transcript. So we're going into the transcript class. Let me just move this over so it's a bit more clear. So what's happening in here, we're returning an empty registration array. So now we found our problem. This is why we can't index into our array. So let's stop the debugger now. And let's do the correct implementation for this method.
So Tian, just before you continue, just about the debugger, if you're still not feeling comfortable, on day one, I kind of suggested one optional tutorial series that you can actually look into the elementary programming in Java. So if you look at that, you can actually see some section there about how to use debugger in more examples. So I really encourage you to really learn about how to use debugger. And also about the array and also integer pattern. So remember there's written notes about point and point collector, which I also kind of mentioned to you guys on day one. Also take a look at that. It's also going to help on your programming test as well.
Okay, so for the correct implementation, it's this specific programming pattern, which you guys also probably saw in your Lab 0 Part 2 tutorial. So I'm not going to type everything out, but I'll explain generally what's going on. So first, we're making a new registration array, specifically of the length of however many non-null elements are in our registrations array attribute up here. Okay, so that's what report is. And then what we're doing in this for loop is we're assigning the values of this dot registrations to the slots in report at the corresponding index values. So we're basically just making a copy of the registrations attribute array into the new report array, and then we're returning report. So yeah, now it's going to return an array with only all the stored elements and none of the null elements of the registrations array. So if we run the JUnit test, we pass. So now we can go on to the next test case.
Just one comment to make. So if you look at line number 19 of the transcript class, you can see the for loop over there. We say I strictly less than this.nor. I believe I kind of mentioned that briefly in the tutorial. Why do we not specify I less than this.registrations.length, right? The entire array, right? You may want to think about that question there. If you try that one there, you might run into null pointer exception, right? So there's a little question for you, okay? One more time. If you look at line number 19, so the condition there in the middle, we say I less than this.nor. However, if you change that to be I less than this.registrations array.length, that one is going to run into you some null pointer exception. So we did talk about that in Lab 0 Part 2. So please review that as well. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So now let's move on to the next part. So now we have an overloaded version of add registration that instead of taking a registration object, it's going to take a string for the course name and a number for the number of credits. So let's make that method. And here I'll name this parameter course and this one credits. So for this one, you can use pretty much the same pattern that you did for add registration. Okay, but instead of assigning it R, we can assign it a new registration object. So I'm going to make a registration object, R, and then we're going to do new registration. And in here, we're going to put course and credits. So now we're assigning the slot of registrations array at this .nor the reference to the new registration object. Okay, and then we're incrementing this .nor. So if we run the test case, sorry, I was just getting rid of the compilation errors just because it didn't save properly. Okay, so if we run the test case, we should be good, but this may not be the ideal way of doing it. So I'll give you two other options of writing this. Either we just skip the R variable altogether and we assign directly the new registration object. So this, if you remember from your lectures, is called an anonymous object. So we're just taking the reference to this object and assigning it directly to this .registrations at this .nor. Another option you have is to just use the method that you created before. So the method you created before already has all of the code that you need. So we do add registration, and then we pass it the new registration object. And this way, you don't have to worry about incrementing the NOR variable because it's already done for you in here. And you also won't have any repeated code, which is just a good design principle. Okay, so let's run it. We should be good. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Now this one is a new method called add registrations. So instead of taking only one registration object that like we did before, this one is taking a registration array. So registrations here we see is an array with a registration object. So this is an array of length 1. There's only one thing in here, but that's still different from like a actual registration object just by itself. So this is an array. We need to somehow assign all of the elements in this array to the empty slots in our registrations array in transcript. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I have a little illustration showing that. So I'll just run you through like the general idea of what we need to do. So if you see here, we have our registrations array. Okay, this is just like a specific case that might happen. This isn't what's actually happening in our code right now. But like, for example, if this were the case, we have two registration objects stored in our registrations array right now. And then we're passing rs, which is a new registration array containing 3 elements. What we need to do is we need to assign rs at index 0. So rs at index 0. We need to somehow, just this one, we need to somehow assign it over to this slot. Okay? And then we need to do the same thing for the next one. So rs at index 1, which is this one over here, we're going to assign it to this. And same thing for this one over here. Okay, and also remember we have this .nor, so we need to increment this one as well. So instead of 2, now it's going to be 5. Okay, so this is generally what we need to do for this method. So let's try coding that in. So first, remember that we need to repeat the step of assigning the rs, the registration objects in rs, into our registrations array in transcripts. So since we're repeating that action, we're going to use a loop. So we'll do for int I equals 0. Okay, and the I value is going to be used to index into the rs array. Okay, so we're going to start at I is 0. And then how many times we need to repeat the loop? It's going to be however many elements are in the rs array. So in this case, it's 3. In other cases, it might be different. So what we can do is we start at I, and then we do I less than rs. Sorry, I'm going to change this to rs. Okay, I less than rs dot length, and then I plus plus. Okay, and then in here, we want to add rs at I, right? So we'll do this dot registrations equal rs at I. Sorry, this dot registrations at, and this part is going to be this dot nor, okay, because we want to add it to the next available slot in our array. And then after we add each thing into the array, we're going to increment this dot nor. Okay, so does this make sense? You guys okay? Okay, so if you have any questions, just let me know. Feel free to ask questions. I might not always explain things the most clearly, so just let me know if it's confusing. So yeah, this should be good now. Let's try running this. Okay, so this is fine. Another way we can do this is, again, use the add registration method we already have and pass it rs at index I. So this dot add registrations, and then pass it rs at index I. And this will also work.
Well, Tian Tian, maybe you can undo and maybe keep those two lines in comments. Okay. So yeah, we can also let people actually choose whichever version they prefer.
Okay, so moving on to the next one. So this is just testing it again. Let's try running it and see what happens. Yeah, so it passes. This one is just testing the add registrations method with an array of more than one registration object. Okay, so moving on to this one. Now we have a new method called getMarks. So let's make that method over here. Again, check the return type. It should be int. And then the parameter is the course name. Okay, so what this does is, given the name of some existing course, return its current marks on the transcript. Okay, so somehow we're going to need to, let me just go over here. So somehow we're going to need to go into our registrations array and check each of the registrations. Okay, so each registration is going to have a course name, and this should be assigned some like value, like math or something. I don't know. Anyways, this will be assigned some value. You're going to need to check if that course name is equal to the course name that we passed the method. So for example, if we call getMarks and put the argument as math, it's going to need to check if the course name is equal to math for this one. And if it's not, it's going to check the next one, and so on. So going back to Eclipse, how are we going to do this? We need to loop through the registrations array. So we'll do a for loop. And we're going to start at the beginning of the array. And we're going to go until this dot number of elements. Okay, and then we do the I++. And then in here, we want to check the condition of if this dot registrations at the index of I, if that course name, so we're going to get the course name, and we're going to check if it's equal to the course parameter value. Okay, and if it is equal, then we want to return its current marks. Right, so let's create a variable to store the return value. So we'll do int mark equals, and we'll set it to 0 for now. And then in here, we'll do mark equal this dot registration at the index I, and then we're going to get the mark. Okay, and now we can return that mark value. So now let's try running this. And we're good. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, so now for this one, we don't see any compilation errors. But if we run it, there's going to be an assertion failure. So over here, it's expecting the value of -1, right? And in the comment, it says, when attempting to get marks for some non-existing course, simply return -1. So make sure you always read the comments. And in this case, we want to return the value of -1 if there's no course in the registrations that has that specific course name. So we're going to set the initial value of mark to be -1. And this way, if we don't find the course, so if this condition is never true, then we never reset the mark value, right? So then we're just going to return -1. So now should be good. Okay. So let's do this one. Now we have another method, setMarks. So this is kind of doing the same thing, but instead of returning the mark for that specific registration, we're actually setting the mark for that specific registration. So here, let me put course, and then this is the mark that we want to set. So I'll name it mark. And I'm going to copy and paste this code because we're basically doing the same thing. Right, we're just looping through the registrations array, and then we're checking if the name of that registration is equal to the name that we passed. Okay, but in here, instead of assigning mark a value, we're going to set the mark. So we'll do this.registrations at i.setMarks, and then we'll set it to the value of mark. Okay, so now we should be good. Yep. Okay, so if you see the red underline, usually it's just because it didn't save yet, or like it didn't update. So yeah, if you know you implemented everything correctly, just make sure you save it and it should be okay. Now, we do have code duplicates here. So this is kind of a bad design because there are code duplicates. For the programming test, it's completely fine to just reuse your code if you need to. But sometimes, if you're working on a larger scale project, you want to try using helper methods to get rid of the duplicates. So that helper method should be released in your solutions. So you can take a look at that if you want. But for this review session, I'm just going to skip over that. So yeah, let's just move on to the next test case now. So for this one, it says when attempting to set marks for some non-existing course, simply do nothing. And so we already fulfilled that requirement over here, right? Because if we don't get to this condition, or we don't pass this condition, then we'll never set the marks. So we're good. So this is going to pass, hopefully. Yep. Okay. Moving on to the next one. So this one is introducing a new method called getWeightedGPA. So let's make that. And we're returning a double. And how do we know it's a double? Well, first, we can see we're casting to a double here in the expected value. So it's probably going to be a double. But also, we have some tolerance value here as the third argument to assert equals. So I think Professor Jackie explained in your lecture what this tolerance value means. It's basically just because double values aren't always super precise. So we need a little bit of tolerance just to account for that. So we're returning a double. And let's look at the comments to see how we need to implement this method. So it says weighted GPA denotes the weighted grade point average. And then you calculate it by calculating the sum of the weighted grade points for all registrations. Okay, so that first part, if we need to sum up the weighted grade points for all the registrations, that means we're doing some repeated action, right? So again, we're going to use a loop. So for int I equals 0, so we're going to start at the beginning of the registration array. And then I less than this dot NOR, so we go until the number of registrations that are stored, and then we increment I. And in here, we need to sum up those weighted grade points. So let's create a variable called sum. Okay, and we'll set it to 0, because if we don't have any registrations, the sum is just going to be 0. And then for each of the registrations, we're going to add to that sum this dot registrations at I, and then we conveniently have a method already called getWeightedGradePoint, so we're going to use that, and this will add it to the sum. Okay, but we're not done here yet. It says after summing up all of the weighted grade points, you need to divide by the number of registrations. So what we want to return is the sum, and then we need to divide by this .nor. So there's one more step you need to do here. So if we try running this test case, you should, oh, okay, never mind. So this, okay, I guess that wasn't a good example. In this case, we have an integer value, so it was fine. But let's say that this is some double value, then we need to cast one of these variables, either sum or this .nor, into a double to ensure that we're doing division with double, the double data type instead of ints. Because if we do only ints, it'll truncate the decimal places. So I'll just cast this one. Okay, and casting has the highest precedence, which means it'll cast first and then divide. So it's really like doing something like this. And as long as you have one double in there, it's going to convert the other integer into a double as well. So we're good with this one.
Okay, just one comment here. So here we only have just test number 15, just one test case for this particular method. So somehow, if you forgot to really cast, as Tian demonstrated, you might be able to get around with that. But just to be 100% correct, let's say, for example, in Java, if we say two integers, 5 divided by 2, it's going to give you just 2. That would be the integer quotient. But what I really want here is 5 divided by 2, I want to get 2.5, the precision, right, about the quotient. To really do that, you got to make sure either the numerator or the denominator is somehow cast to double. That's what Tian is trying to do here. So in case you got anything similar, not necessarily the coming programming test, but whenever you're expecting some double value from the division, always remember, either the numerator or denominator should be cast to double. Otherwise, you only get some integer. You will lose the precision. Okay.
Yes? So do you mean there's like no assertion failure here? Oh, this? Okay, so it's because there's kind of like a hierarchy to certain data types. So for integers, we can automatically cast it to a double. So the compiler does that for you. It automatically casts it to a double because you don't lose any information when you convert an int into a double. So it'll automatically just cast to a double. That's why there's no compilation error. But say you want to cast from double to int. That you need to use an explicit cast. Because if you cast from a double to int, that's going to have some loss of information, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to summarize, whenever you're expecting a double, you can always give an integer. Let's say if I give you integer 2, it's going to be converted into 2.0 automatically. You don't need to do any explicit cast yourself. On the other hand, if you're expecting some integer, and then I'll give you 23.46, that's not going to compile. So you need to do some explicit cast to say cast to integer to get rid of the 0.46. Yeah, so these are two different scenarios.
Okay, so we're done with this test case. Let's move on to the next one.
Okay, so I think, how about we take a very short break because it's about 40, almost 50 minutes. Maybe take a short break and then we'll resume. Okay. Okay. And meanwhile, why don't we take attendance quickly, right? Just in case you have to leave, that's okay. But let me just take attendance first.
Okay, so let's continue from where we left off. So we were just on this test 16, which is introducing the new method, delete registration. So here it says delete the first registration at index 0, right? So we know that we're passing the index number, and we want to delete a registration from the registrations array at that specific index. So let me go to this illustration over here. Basically, what we're trying to do is, let's say we want to delete the registration object at index 4. Okay, so we want to get rid of this thing. Okay, so how can we do this? So the way we want to do this is we're gonna just move the references. So you see right now the arrow is pointing here, right? We want to instead point this over to the next element and delete the reference to this. Or we don't really have to delete it manually, right? Because when we reassign, the reference is gone. So now this object here is not part of the array anymore. Okay, but now we have two slots pointing to the same object. So what do we need to do? We're going to move this over to the next one. So what does this look like? This looks like R at 4, so the first case was 4, is going to be assigned R at 5. Okay, and then the next part is R at 5 is assigned R at index 6. And then if we do the next one, we move this over here. What this is R at 6 is assigned R at 7. Okay, and now when we get to the end of the array, sometimes it'll be a null value. But in this case, let's say that your array is full, right? What do we do when we get to the end of this array? We're going to point this over at null. Okay, so we're going to set R at 7 equal to null. Okay, so the general pattern that we have here is we have, sorry, let me just move this over a little bit. The general pattern we have over here is we're setting R at some index I to R at index I plus 1. Right? And then here, for this one, we're setting R at some index number to be equal to null. But notice that 7 here is this dot NOR minus 1, right? So we're going to set R at this dot, okay, I don't have space. Let me just write NOR. So we're going to set it at NOR minus 1. Okay, so this is generally what we want to do. So let's start programming that.
So what Tintin showed over here is if you're not exactly sure how to program a particular method, always think about some example. And based on the example, think about how you can generalize it. Loop counter, object references, etc. Right?
Yeah, so let's start by doing, Let's start by doing over here, we want to set R at I equal to R at I plus 1. And what is our starting I value? If you notice, that's 4, right? And that corresponds to the index that we want to delete. So let's go back. So we're going to do a for loop because we're repeating this action of assigning it to the next slot. So int I, and as I said, we want to start at the index where we want to delete. I'm going to rename this parameter to index. If you keep this parameter as I, you can just use a different variable for the loop counter. But just for clarity, I'm going to name this index. And I will start it at the index value of where we want to delete. And then we're going to go up until, if we go back to the diagram, we're going to go up until this number here, which is this dot NOR minus 2, right? Because it's 6, 8 minus 2. Anyways, we are going to go less than or equal to this dot NOR minus 2. Okay, and then we go I plus plus. So now in here, we're going to do this dot registrations at I is equal to this dot registrations at I plus 1, like we discussed earlier. Okay, and then at the end here, we set this guy to null, right? So at NOR minus 1, we want to set it to null. So we'll go this dot registrations at this dot NOR minus 1 equal to null. Okay, and now we've removed one element from the array. That means the NOR counter has to go down, right? So we're going to decrement it now. Okay, so that should be it. Let's run the test case. And we pass. Okay, so this one is good now. So we can move on to the next one. So for the next one, we see we need to make a new class. So I'm going to go ahead and make the new class. Make sure you set it to the model package. And again, I'm just going to drag it over. Okay, so here we have a default constructor. There's no red underline because every class automatically comes with a default constructor. But that default constructor kind of just does nothing. So it's there. It's not going to show up in your class, but it's there. However, it doesn't do anything. So if we want to actually have a constructor that works, we probably need to implement it ourselves. So let's do a public registrar. Okay, and then what do we need to set in here? So again, if you're unsure about what attributes you need, go up to the top. It'll tell you over here. A registrar system stores a list of up to 100 transcripts. So we are going to need a transcript array. And I'll just name it transcripts. And again, make sure you have a counter variable. I'll name it NOT for number of transcripts. And then in our constructor now, we can initialize the transcripts array. And it goes up to 100, right? So we'll put 100 over here. Okay, and then this .NOT starts as 0. So now that we have the transcripts array, we can try implementing this getAllTranscripts method. So again, check the return type, confirm it's correct. And then it says here, return as an array all of the stored transcripts in the registrar. So this is very similar to what we did here for getReport. So I'm going to grab the code from the solutions to save some time. So here we have all of this. It's literally the exact same pattern. So you should be okay just reviewing this pattern from the Lab 0 Part 2 tutorials. So make sure you really get familiar with this pattern too, because it's pretty important. So let's just copy paste this in. And now this one should be good. Okay, so next one. Now we need to add transcripts. So again, this is basically the exact same thing as what we did for the registrations over here. So I'm just going to grab it from here again. Okay, so yeah, just make sure the parameter names match up as well. All right, so that one is good. Now, one more method we need to do is getStudentName. And so we can create the method getStudentName like this, and make sure the return type is a string. But notice that we're now in our transcripts class, right? And the reason why is because the context object that we're calling getStudentName on is of the type transcript. And how do we know this? It's because all is a transcript array. So any element inside of that is going to also be a transcript. So this is getStudentName in the transcript class. And this is really just an accessor. So we're just going to return the name of the student. Okay, so let's try running this. And we pass. So we can move on to the next one. Okay, so now we're introducing another method, set registrar office. Okay, so let's take a look at what's happening over here. We have a new registrar object, right? I have an illustration of this. Let me just switch over to it really quickly. It's a little bit complicated, but we'll focus on one part at a time. So first, we're creating a registrar object. Okay, so over here, we create a registrar object with the name R, and then we're creating a transcript object with the name Alice. Okay, so we have that plus the transcript object over here, so we have these two right now. And then to Alice, we're going to add the registration math. Okay, so going back here, we have Alice, and in our registrations array, we're adding a registration with the course name math. Okay, and now we have a new method. So we need to set the registrar office for Alice. So this is implying that we need some sort of attribute to store the registrar office. So let's make a new attribute. So we do private, and then this is going to be a registrar, and I'll name it just registrar as well. And then initially here, it'll be set to null. So we don't need to set it, but I'll just do it to be explicit. We're going to just put it as null to begin with. And then we need to set this registrar value to some registrar object. So in here, we're basically just going to do, it's just a regular setter, so this dot registrar, and then equal to R. Bigger?
You mean the font size? Sorry, you mean the font size or the diagram? The font size,
The
right,
text?
in the Eclipse.
Okay, yeah, I can do that. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so this is okay? Okay.
Well, you want to sit a bit closer? Might be easier for you. Yeah, but if you sit further, right, it's going to make it worse.
No, I was already sitting close. I was sitting.
You want to, do you think sitting here might help? How about here? Do you think this might help over here? How about here? Would it help?
Maybe right here.
Right here, it's okay. Yeah, if you want to sit here. Yeah. Yeah, you can continue.
Okay, so we set the registrar to whatever we pass this method, and that should be okay for now. Or actually, this is basically the final implementation for this method. So this is good. And on our diagram, we can see that for our transcript A, we've set the registrar attribute to this registrar that we made earlier. And this should actually be R over here. So I'm going to put R there. All right. So we have that so far. And then we're going to add the transcript for Alice into the registrar that we just connected to Alice. So remember, we just connected this registrar. And then in the registrar, there's a transcript array. And we're going to connect that over here to Alice. So we're setting the array at index 0.
What are we learning about?
Oh, so we're just going over the practice test. And right now we're on test case 18. Oh, sorry, test case 19, my bad. Test case 19. And I'm just tracing over what's happening in the code. Okay. So we did that. Okay, now we're making a new transcript here. We're doing the same thing. We're adding a registration called coding. So we have a new transcript. And there's a reason why I'm going over this right now. This is going to be useful in a little bit. So we have a transcript. We have a registration called coding. Okay. And then we're setting the registrar office for Ali now. So B is Ali. And we're setting the registrar office and also connecting the registrar office to that transcript. So we're connecting Ali over here to this registrar office. And then in the transcripts array for this registrar, we're assigning it Ali's reference.
Wait, can we see the diagram?
Yep.
Let's copy down this diagram.
We're going to make this available later,
Yeah.
so you may just want to, maybe focus
Yeah.
on maybe understanding first.
I want to draw it. Is there like 2 minutes?
Oh, I think we got to continue. Maybe we focus on understanding now, and then we'll make it available later.
Yeah, we're
Wait,
going
wait,
to
wait,
share it
hold
with
on.
you guys later.
Okay, just give me, can I have like 30 seconds?
Okay.
I can ask a question.
Yeah.
So you're basically getting the name and using it as a context object to point to the transcript? Are you doing that? Because there you're saying Ali
Okay.
is pointing to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
transcript.
So
I'm kind of confused.
yeah, I'm sorry about that. So this diagram was a bit of a last minute addition. So there's a bit of inaccuracy over here. So Ali is actually supposed to be one of the attributes.
What do you mean my email?
So our reference variable is
Can we
B.
just
So that's our variable. And then Ali here is actually supposed to be one of the attributes inside of this transcript object.
Oh,
Yeah, it's the name attribute for this transcript object.
so you get the name and then what you do with it is
So you don't need to do anything with the name right now. I'm just pointing out that this transcript object has the name Ali, and this one has the name Alice. This will be useful in a little bit, but I'll get to that later.
Yeah, you can think about the A and B here are the reference variable. They store the addresses of the two transcript objects. And then Ali and Alice strings, they are more like a values for the attributes. We just didn't have space to put them down. So that's why I put it aside.
So
Yeah.
basically the names are in the transcript.
Yeah, you can think about, yes. Yeah. So Alice and Ali, so they are the values for the attributes for these two objects. We just didn't put it in. Right. Mhm.
Okay, so let's continue here. Yeah, so we set the registrar office and also add the transcript for Ali into the transcripts array for the registrar R. Okay, so we're done that. And then we're returning all of the transcripts in the registrar. So recall over here, the array has Alice's transcript and Ali's transcript, right? So that the length of the returned array should be 2. And that's what we're checking in this test case. So t.length, make sure it's equal to 2. And this should be fine. Now we have a new method. So the reason why I went over all of that is because you need some context to understand how to implement this method here. So this method, we're returning a string array of students' names who are enrolled in a specific course. Okay? And so basically what this means is that we need to return a list of all the student names who are enrolled in a course, for example, coding. Okay, and down here it says, assume a student is able to inquire about a list of students enrolled in a course, which means that the student that's inquiring about this, so for example, A, aka Alice, she's able to inquire about this, but she might not be enrolled in coding herself. So if we go back to our diagram, see Alice is enrolled only in math, not coding, but she can check if there's other students enrolled in coding, which is up here. So how can we do this? So if we're starting from Alice here, starting from this transcript, we have a registration array, right? So this is one way we can get the courses. But Alice isn't registered to coding, so how can we get over to here? Instead, we can check the registrar. So if we follow the registrar up to here, we see that the registrar has an array of transcripts. So we can follow that over to this array and look at each student, which can include the student themselves who is inquiring, but it also includes other students, right? And we can traverse this array, check each student one by one, and then check their registrations, and then check if they have a registration with that specific course name. So let me show you guys another diagram that's a little bit more streamlined so you can understand intuitively what this means. So if we're starting at transcript, we're going to go down to the registrar that they're connected to. Okay, so we got the registrar. Then from the registrar, we're going to go to all of the transcripts that are stored in the registrar. And then we're going to first use one loop. Okay, we need to loop through all of the transcript objects. Okay, and we need to check each transcript that's in this registrar. And then we need a second loop inside of the first one to check each transcript object and see if they have a registration that has this desired course name. Okay, let me say that again because I think I didn't explain that the best. Okay, so basically we have a first loop here, looping through the transcripts. And then for each transcript, we need to check their registrations. So that's going to be our second loop. So the second loop is going to check each registration object and see if the course name is equal to the course name that we passed as the argument.
So guys, any question about the diagram, illustration? Okay, hopefully that's clear. Okay.
Okay, so let's start coding. So first, we need to get the registrar from this transcript. So it's that registrar. Okay, and recall from the registrar, we need to get the transcripts array. So we'll go this.registrar.get transcripts. Okay, and we want to save this in some variable to use later. So let's make a transcript array. Name it transcripts. Actually, I'll name it T, so it's a little bit less to type out. So we have T assigned to get all transcripts from the registrar, which is all the transcripts that are in the registrar. Okay, so now we need a loop. So we'll do for int I equals 0. So we start at the very beginning of this transcript array. Now, how many times do we need to loop? We're going to do t.length. So it goes over all of the elements in T. Okay, so inside of here, now, for each transcript, we need to get their registration, right? Their registrations array. For each transcript, we need to get their registrations array. So we're going to go in here. We do a registrations array, and we'll name it R. And then we're going to do T at I dot get, sorry, I believe there should be get report. Yeah, so get report. So this is going to give us the registration array for each transcript object. Okay, and now recall that for each transcript object, we got our registrations array. Now we need to loop through the registrations array and check each of the registrations. So that's going to be another for loop. So in here, for, and this time we want to use a different counter variable, just so that we don't have two variables of the same name. That's not going to compile. So we'll do int j equals 0. And then how many times are we going to do this? We're going to do r.length. So we go over the whole registration array that was returned. Okay, so now in here, we're looping through all of the registrations, right? So for each registration, we need to check the course name. So how do we check the course name if it's equal to something? We're going to use an if statement. So if, and then we're going to check R at the index J this time, because we're in this for loop. And we're going to get the course name for that specific registration. And then because this is a string, sorry, this is a string, we're going to use equals. And we'll check if it's equal to the parameter here. I'm just going to rename this to course. So we're going to check if it's equal to the course name that we passed. Okay, so now, if it is equal, what do we need to do? For this method, we need to return a string array of students' names who are enrolled in the course, right? So we need to somehow save the student's name into an array. So let's make a new string array. We'll call it temp, which means temporary, because we're going to need to go over this again later in a little bit. So temp, and then this is a new string array. Okay, what's the length of this? So what's the maximum number of students that can be saved into here? That's going to be the number of transcripts in the registrar, right? So let me move this down over here so we can use the t variable. So this is going to be t. This is going to be t dot length. Okay, so now in here, if the course name is equal to the parameter value, then we're going to do temp at some index is equal to the student, okay? And so what is this current student? That's going to be t at the index I. Okay, so that might be a little bit confusing. I think I'm going to actually create another variable here so it's a little bit more clear. I'll name this transcript. Or actually, I'll name this student. So this is going to be t at the index I. Okay, so then for each student, we're going to get their report, right? And then we're going to check through all of their registrations. And if the registration matches the course name we gave as the input, then we're going to save the student's name. So student.get student name into our string array called temp. Okay, now what index do we need to save this as? Well, we're going to need another counter variable. So int, I'm going to name this count. So this keeps track of how many students we've saved into our string array. So at the very beginning, there's going to be 0 students saved in it, so it's 0. And now we can use it as our index variable over here. And then every time we add a student, we need to increase count. So yeah, we just increment, and that should be it for this part. Okay, so just to review, we're going over the transcripts array, right? We're going over the transcripts array. We're taking each transcript that's inside of the transcript array, and we're getting a registration array from it. And then for each thing in the registration array, we're going to check if the course name is equal to the course that we gave when we called the method. Does that make sense? Okay.
I'll add something very quickly. So remember the PDF notes I mentioned, right? So there's a method called getTrojan2. So that method there can also help you understand this, right? So if you really want to catch up with this kind of pattern here, take a look at the PDF as well. It's going to help. Okay.
Okay, so now we have an array filled with the student names. However, remember that it has the length of the total number of transcripts. And it's not always that the number of students taking a course is going to be equal to the number of all the transcripts in the registrar, right? So if it were equal, that would mean all of the students in that registrar are taking that one course, which isn't going to always be the case. So we need to do another loop to copy the values of our temporary array here. We want to copy it into a new array that has the correct size. So we're going to do string. Now we'll name this result, because that's what we want to return. And then we're going to do new string array. How many things do we need in this string array? That's going to be the number that count is, right? Because count is what's keeping track of how many students we have in our array. So we're going to do count.
And then string array decoration.
Oh.
Yeah. The left-hand side of the equal sign.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. Yeah, string result is a new string array. Okay, so now we're going to use a for loop. And we'll start at 0, and we'll go until count. And I++. And we're just going to copy all of the things in temp into our result array. Okay, and then now we can return result. So I believe this is the correct implementation. Let's run the test case to see what happens. Okay, we're good. So that's basically that method. And now we can move on to the next test case.
Question?
Yeah.
We do results equals temp instead of doing the other for loop. Does that work?
So it won't work because they have different lengths. So our temp array has the length of the total number of transcripts that are in the registrar office, which is going to be more, or it could be equal to, but in a lot of cases, it's going to be more than the number of actual students that are taking the course. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Daniel, let's say, for example, let's say there are 100 students in total in the system. Like I said, 100. So the temp array is going to be of length 100. But maybe only 50 students are enrolled in the coding course. In that case, the result should be of length 50 rather than 100. So the count over there is really to make sure we know 50 rather than 100. Yeah.
Okay, so let's uncomment this one now. And there's no compilation errors, so I'm just going to run the test case. And should have a pass. Yeah. So this test case is just testing that method again. So since we implemented it correctly, we should pass it. And same with this one, I believe. So let's try running this. Yep. So that's good. Okay. Let's do this one now. I think this is also testing the same thing. So we run this. We should get a pass, yeah. And then this one. Okay, so this one should also pass because it's testing the same thing. Mm-hmm. But I do want to point out something in this test case. Here we're creating two distinct registrar offices, right? And what this test case is testing for is basically, given two different registrars, the students in one registrar can only see the students or the other students in that specific registrar. And given another registrar, the students in that registrar can only see the other students in that registrar. So they're separate. So that's just what that test case is testing. Okay, so now we're on to our last method. So this method is testing a static method. And we know it's static because instead of calling the method on some context object, we're actually calling it on the class itself. Okay, so when we generate this method here, we see that it's static, which confirms what we observed. So it says here, reset ID counter. So this should give us a hint that there might be some attribute called ID counter. So let's make an ID counter here. Now, given that this is a static method, we want our ID counter to also be static because we can't use non-static attributes inside of static methods. So we'll do static, and then ID counter is going to be an int, most likely, so we'll do int. And then with all static variables inside of your class, you want to set it to an initial starting value. So how can we figure out what starting value this is? Well, we can look into the test case and try to pick up on what that might be. So here, we're creating a new transcript, right? And then we have another method here called getID. So this method should return some string that tells us what ID number this transcript has. And the first one here is 1, right? So that should tell us that our initial ID counter value should be 1. Okay, that also tells us that when we reset the ID counter, we want to set it to a 1. Okay, so now let's deal with getID. So getID should return a string. Okay, and this is telling us that there's some ID value for each transcript object, right? So let's make another attribute for the ID. So private int ID. In this case, it's not going to be static because it's specific to that transcript instance, right? So it's not static. And now, in our constructor, if you recall in the lecture, you guys probably have seen something like the bank class and like accounts and stuff. And those accounts have ID numbers, right? So this is very similar to that. We're going to give each transcript an ID number. So we'll do this dot ID equals to ID counter. Okay, and then every time we assign a new ID, we want to do ID counter plus plus. So we increment that so that no two transcripts have the same ID number. I don't think I need to visualize this, but I will do it just really quickly. So basically, we have a static variable called ID counter that's tied to the class. So this variable here exists for all the transcript objects. Okay, and it also exists even when there's no transcript objects. So it's independent of the instances. So we start with a 1 here. Now, say we get a new transcript object. Okay, say we get a new transcript object. Pretend this one down here doesn't exist. Okay, say we just have one transcript object. What's going to happen is we assign this number over here to the ID attribute of the transcript, and then we increment it. And say we have another transcript, a new transcript object, then we do the exact same thing. We assign this to, oh, that's a pencil. Okay, we assign this to, and then we increment by 3, or by 1, so that it becomes 3. So that's what's happening there. Okay, and now finally, we need to deal with the return value of getID. So we see that it's returning a string that says the student's name, and then ID is, and then the ID number. So when we have a string and variables that we need to stick into that string, we want to use string.format. We can also use concatenation but I find this is a little bit cleaner and also quicker. So how do we do this? First, we need the student's name. So we'll do %s for string. Okay, and then after the name is apostrophe s, and then ID is, and then we need the ID number, which is a number, so we'll do %d. Okay, so here, now we're going to put this dot name. Okay, and whatever value is in this dot name is going to replace the first % here. And then we'll do this dot ID. And whatever is in ID is going to replace the second %. So now, I hope I didn't miss anything. Let's try running the test case. And yeah, we pass. Okay, so we're done. All of the test cases, and this is good. We're basically done the practice test now. In your programming test, if you finish early, then I would recommend you try writing some test cases of your own for any implementations you might be unsure of. So, for example, there was the get weighted grade point, if you remember, here. If you remember here, it accepted like an integer value, even though it's supposed to be double. So in cases like this, where there's only one test case or test method that's testing it, you might want to write extra ones just to confirm that it's working correctly. But that's only if you have time. Typically, you might run out of time at the end, so don't worry too much about that. Okay, and one last thing to mention is when the time is almost out, if you have any more compilation errors left over, make sure you get rid of them, because you'll receive a penalty if you leave any compilation errors in there. So save maybe like 10 minutes at the end to just confirm you have no more compilation errors. Okay, so that's basically it for this review session. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask.
Okay, guys, any questions for Tian Tian? Okay, if not, we'll end the recording now. So if you got any further, we are happy to answer you at the front. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, thank you.